Welcome back to the Hard Skills Show, where we take a deep dive into the most challenging soft skills required to navigate leadership uncertainty, complexities, and change today and into the future. I'm your host, Dr. Mira Brancu, psychologist, leadership consultant, and founder of TowerScope. Now, today's episode was inspired by a desire for me to share more, not just about how to navigate organizations, but also the current societal stressors. Because, in our own organizational experiences, it's a microcosm of our experiences of society, right? And many people, whether they have formal leadership roles or those who want to find their voice to act on their values, find it difficult to speak up and use their voice when the time comes. And there's a disconnect between what we feel is right to do in the moment and whether we feel we can do it effectively and successfully. And this is where our guest comes in to help us learn more about how this skill can be learned. So whether you're a leader, managing a team, or simply trying to support your colleagues, this conversation is for you. So let me introduce our guest today, Dr. Mary Gentile. She is creator and director of Giving Voice to Values, which we'll also refer to as GVV, which was launched with the Aspen Institute and Yale School of Management, previously hosted at Babson College for 6 years and now based at UVA Darden. Giving Voice to Values is a values-driven leadership curriculum that has been piloted and or presented in over 1,500 sites globally and has been featured in Financial Times, Harvard Business Review, Stanford Social Innovation Review, Kinsey Quarterly, and others. Gentile consults, she speaks, she writes on GVV. She was formerly the Richard M. Waitzer Bicentennial Professor of Ethics at UVA Darden and was also previously at Harvard Business School and Babson College. She holds a BA from the College of William and Mary and a PhD from the State University of New York, Buffalo, which, by the way, Mary, I went to Binghamton University, also part of the SUNY system in upstate New York. You were a little farther
Yay,
more
SUNY.
upstate. Yay, SUNY, woo! I heard her keynote at this year's Society of Consulting Psychologists conference, and I just felt like I had to invite her on the show. So welcome, Mary.
Thank you so much, Mira. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Very excited to have her on the show. Also, right next to me, I have her book right here. Let me, for those of you who are watching, I'm going to make sure that you can see this. Yes, Giving Voice to Values. All right. I also have it on my Kindle. So I really did enjoy this, the talk, the book, all the things. But I want to start with some shared language, right? We talk about ethics, we talk about values, you talk about, values-based leadership. Tell us more about how you define it.
Sure. So, my work began and most of my professional career has been in MBA programs, business schools, as you mentioned. And so when we were talking about these kinds of issues in business schools, we'd call it business ethics. And when I started talking to wider audiences, to business practitioners, but even talking to business school students, the language of ethics wasn't necessarily the most effective language. I think when people think about ethics, it's usually a code of ethics. It's a set of rules. It's a set of guidelines. It's often an external set of rules and guidelines. And what I really wanted to do was to help people tap into something more aspirational, something that came from within them. And so I started using the language of values, which is really most psychologists and philosophers and even biologists have identified that there are a certain set of values that are pretty much universally shared by human beings. And so I wanted to talk about that.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I'd love to hear more about the sort of commonly held values, because the first thing, as you were talking, the first thing that came up in my mind is, when you have ethics, it's written down as standards, right? Everybody has to agree, like, these are the ethics in our profession. And when we talk about values, it feels a little bit more nebulous because you and I can have different values. So when you talk about the sort of like more common values that we all hold, what are some of those?
Sure, sure. Yeah, values is one of those overdetermined words. It can mean many different things.
Yeah.
And so I often have to explain what I'm talking about. We can talk about the core values, what philosophers tend to call hypernorms. And those are these set of moral values, ethical values, virtues even, that tend to be universally shared. And those are things like integrity, compassion, justice. The good news about this is that there is this set of core values that are universally shared. It does give you a way of communicating across lots of other differences. The other news about it is that it's a really short list.
Mm.
And so when you're actually trying to communicate with people about values-based choices, you want to think about first, does the issue that we're disagreeing upon actually rise to the level of one of these core values? Or is this more just a matter of my personal preference, my style? I like country, you like city, that kind of thing. So you want to make sure, is it something we can agree to disagree on? Or is this one of those issues that rises to that high level? And if it does, then you want to think about a way of communicating about it that's going to connect with the way your audience sees that value. In other words, don't use the language that comes explicitly or only from your religion or your political beliefs or your sort of social context. Try and find that sort of shared language to be able to help them see how we connect on this issue.
Yeah, I think these are really good points. So well, the first question I have is, um, how do we know if we're disagreeing on a point that actually has something to do with a higher order value versus just like a simple disagreement? Is that something that people have a challenge doing? And if so, how can they sort of like attend or, or tease that apart?
Yeah, I think sometimes people do have some trouble making that distinction because we have emotional reactions when we disagree, right?
Right,
And often when we have that emotional reaction, we think of it as coming from a place of core values or right and wrong.
right.
And so when we actually work with people with giving voice to values, it's really it's a framework for helping people develop the skill, the confidence, and the likelihood of voicing their values, acting on their values, and doing so effectively. When we do that, we actually work with people through a kind of protocol of questions.
Mm,
And the first question we always ask people is to think about, what is the value that's at stake here for you? That there is this kind of self-reflection that has to happen there. And that also addresses the question I mentioned earlier, which is, and is this a value that rises to that level that we really need to find agreement on, or is it something that we can agree to disagree on? And in a business context, this is really very relevant because there's lots of things I'm going to disagree with the employee or the manager who sits next to me. And some of them may be things that are hugely important to me, but have absolutely nothing to do with my work together with them. And so we may have to agree to disagree with on those issues. But when it comes to a core value that has to do with the impact of the work that we're doing on our stakeholders, on our customers, on our colleagues, on our shareholders, et cetera, on our communities, then those are the ones that we need to think about how to really act on effectively.
yeah, and I really appreciate that because um, it is important to know when one of these values is touched upon versus not. Because we get, like you said, we get very defensive. How dare you call me blah, blah, blah? How dare you question my value or my integrity or my, you know, um,
Or intelligence.
intelligence, my expertise, all of this stuff. And knowing like when it starts hitting on a value that is also work related is the most important place to start. That makes perfect sense. Yeah. And then
Yeah,
also being able to connect to other people's language. We use a lot of jargon that is something where we think it's obvious to other people. We use it, in our own, lives or whatever, and then we bring it in, to somebody else, and we think they're going to completely automatically understand. And that is not
right,
the case. That is not the
right.
case. And knowing like what are the parts of our language that are jargony to other people is another piece of like sort of breaking it down, right?
Right, right,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, when we talk about giving voice to values and the procedures that we work people through to give them the opportunity to rehearse and to practice and to pre-script, one of the things that we do is actually think about how am I most skillful, comfortable, likely to express myself? When have I been effective at communicating with people in the past, even if it had nothing to do with values or ethics? Just how am I better at communicating? Am I better in writing? Am I better by asking questions? Am I better in debate?
Mm-hmm.
Those kinds of things. But we also ask people to think about who you're trying to
Mm.
influence. When have you ever seen them change their mind? What kinds of arguments, what kinds of approaches resonate for them? Because you might want to be thinking about ways to enlist that knowledge so that you can be more effective. I have a little story about that, if it's okay to share it.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so the work I've done to create this approach, this pedagogy, if you want to call it that, in curriculum, involved, first of all, interviewing lots of people in organizations at every level, from very junior to very senior. And I gathered a lot of stories. And I remember one of the stories I gathered was from a woman. She was working in a corporation. She was at a very high level, C-suite level, and she told me the story about one day being in a meeting with the CEO and the other C-suite executives. And the CEO was proposing a course of action that he was very invested in. He clearly wanted to do it. She thought it was ethically problematic and problematic in other ways as well. But he was so invested, and everyone was going along with it. And she was somebody who said, she had strong views, but she felt like she wasn't very good at communicating them in that kind of a situation. It would have been combative. It would have been her against the room. And so she silenced herself. She said nothing. And the group took the decision they were going to go forward. This was at the end of the day. She knew this was a bad idea, and she was trying to figure out what to do. So she said she went home and she thought about it, and she thought, I am most effective when I make a data-driven argument
Mm.
that is well thought out and structured and probably in writing. When have I actually seen my CEO make a decision, change his mind, make a decision? He tends to respond to really compelling stories, often
Mm.
about a competitor,
Uh-huh,
about either
uh-huh.
their success or failure. So she said she went home and she wrote the well-structured argument that she knew she could make in a memo. And then this was back in the day of phone calls rather than email, or text. She left a voicemail for her CEO and she said, look, I know we took a decision, so she acknowledged that. But I have some information that I really think you ought to see before you act. So I just need 10 minutes of your time tomorrow morning. So she went in the next morning with her memo, but she had come up with a compelling story about why he should read her memo. She didn't think she did. She didn't think she could come up with a story that would gather all her ideas. It was just not something she was skillful at. So she felt like what she did is she played to both her strengths and his predilections. And in fact, she was effective at changing his mind. I don't say these things will always work, but I am asking to people, think about it in this way. Don't just get passionate, get clever and intelligent about how you communicate.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I have a story about that I'm going to share. But we're reaching an ad break. When we come back, I'll share the little story. And also, I want to sort of expand this out to, you know, continue to explore this issue of like, we have a gut feeling we want to do right, and then we get stuck. Because I love that about your book about how to get unstuck. So you are listening to The Hard Skills with me, Dr. Mira Branco, and our guest, Dr. Mary Gentile, author of Giving Voice to Values. We air on Tuesdays at 5 p.m. Eastern. At that time, you can find us live streaming on LinkedIn, YouTube, several other locations at talkradio.nyc, and we'll be right back in just a moment.
Are you a conscious co-creator? Are you on a quest to raise your vibration and your consciousness? I'm Sam Leibowitz, your conscious consultant, and on my show, The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, we will touch upon all these topics and more. Listen live at our new time on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time. That's The Conscious Consultant Hour, Awakening Humanity, Thursdays 12 noon on talkradio.nyc.
Are you a high-achieving, growth-oriented leader? Are you interested in developing your authentic leadership while creating a healthy, inclusive workplace? Hi, I'm Dr. Mira Brancu, host of The Hard Skills on talkradio.nyc at 5 p.m. Eastern on Tuesdays, where we discuss how leaders develop the hard skills needed to make a greater impact. We interview experts, have live coaching, and tackle these challenges. Listen to The Hard Skills on Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC. Uplift, educate, empower.
Welcome back to The Hard Skills with me, Dr. Mira Brancu, and our guest today, Dr. Mary Gentile of Giving Voice to Values. And before we went to the ad break, you were sharing this story that reminded me of my own story of speaking up. And I feel like there's two kinds of people. There's people like me who, in the beginning of my career, was politically clueless, and I did speak up to a leader at the highest level of an organization, and I shared my concern about something I thought was unethical. And what happened after that was lots of conversations without me about me. And I ended up being shut out of lots of decision-making opportunities and labeled as clueless. And it took me a long time to learn the political savvy part of this. And actually, it's what, led me to write Millennials Guide to Workplace Politics and the workbook. Like, once I learned this, I wanted to decode it for everybody else,
Yeah.
But you spoke a little bit to that, like understanding your audience and how they will receive that information well is part of it. There's a second group of people that want to do the right thing, imagine doing the right thing, or are very much, find these values important, and then find themselves stuck acting in the moment. And that is how we see tragedies, atrocities, human rights violations, bullying, other bad behavior happening because so many people get stuck and not sure how to intervene. And I think your book really speaks to that as well. And so I'm curious, for that group of people, why or how does this disconnect happen? What makes it so hard to act on the things that we believe are important to us?
Right. Well, there's lots of reasons for that. And a lot of people have done research on that. A number of the reasons that are really at the top of the list are fear of retaliation of some sort, or fear of futility, that I'm going to do all this and it's not going to make a difference anyway, then I might end up suffering for it. And why would I put myself out there if it's not going to make a difference? So those are two of the most common.
Yeah.
But then there's also things that are a little more nuanced. We know stuff from behavioral ethics, from psychology research now, about how we react to values conflicts. And we know, for example, that in many circumstances, perhaps sometimes in most circumstances, we tend to react automatically, even emotionally, kind of unconsciously, and we do what we think is possible. And then we rationalize post hoc why it was the right thing to do, or why it was the only thing to do, the only thing that we could do. And we're not doing this because we're trying to be evil. It's kind of a self-protective measure, because you don't want to live in that space of cognitive dissonance where you know something's wrong and you do it anyways, right? So our brains protect us from that, and then there's also other things, where there's biases, decision-making biases, where we are vulnerable to obedience to authorities. We tend to think, well, they must know better, right? Or they have the experience. Or we're vulnerable to things like false consensus bias, where we assume, well, everybody else must think this, groupthink. All of these things tend to react. And then one that's very relevant for the work I do with giving voice to values is that we think there's only one way to react. We think that the only to act is to speak up, to shake your fist and stamp your foot and speak truth to power, kind of be a martyr. And a lot of what I'm trying to talk to people about is that there are many ways to get your viewpoint out there. And there are ways that are actually going to make it easier, not only safer for you, but easier for the person you're trying to communicate with to understand and to hear and to maybe be persuaded, to be more effective at this. And so what the work I do with Giving Voice to Values is all about is actually giving people the opportunity to identify all of those different strategies and skills and approaches and which ones they personally are most likely to use and to rehearse them and practice them.
I love that. And I'm resonating so much because, I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, it's been kind of a journey for me as well to figure out what is my voice that's natural to me. And I've played around with being a loud advocate, and that felt so disconnected and inauthentic for me, but I wanted to be that, but I just couldn't. And that would hold me back, right?
Yeah.
And then I played around with, am I a cheerleader? Am I a support person? Am I, a quiet disruptor and insurrectionist? Am I, where does it feel right? And when that is aligned, it's so much easier to act. Right. And I'm hearing that is part of your curriculum, is trying to figure out first, like, what's important to me? What do I want to act on? And then the second is, where am I most likely, or how am I most likely to act in the moment? How do I know that about myself?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have another little story about that if you like.
Yeah.
I was doing a consulting job where I was asked to work with was a major financial management firm in New York City, and they were concerned. This was a number of years ago. They were concerned about representation in their workforce, and they felt like they were, pretty much homogeneous in terms of their employee base, and they wanted to reach out to a broader base, and they weren't sure why they weren't attracting that kind of talent, why they weren't finding that kind of a talent. So I'd been asked to do a set of interviews with the very senior level partners in this organization to try and learn some things about how this could be addressed. It seems sort of interesting in today's climate. But anyways, I was doing these interviews, and I was interviewing with a very senior partner in the firm, and he was clearly annoyed at having to talk to me. His meter was running, and this was a waste of time, and he was kind of sitting there with his arms crossed. And so I started asking my questions. I had my little tablet, I was a list of things. And, he just kind of exploded at one point, and he just said, "This is bullshit." Excuse me, but he said, "This is ridiculous." And I said, "Well, can you say something more?" And he said, "This is crazy." He said, "A few years ago, I hired the first African-American male to work in my team that our firm had ever hired at that level. And it didn't work out, and I had to let him go, and I've been paying a price ever since." And I said, "Oh," and I thought, well, I know all the answers to this. I know I could say, well, if you hired a white guy and he didn't work out, would you never hire another white guy? Or did he really not work? Did he actually get the support he needed? I knew all the questions to ask, but I knew this guy was not going to respond to those. He was just, he was just resistant. So my style is to ask questions. And so I said, "Well, can you tell me what price you paid?" And I was really curious. I wasn't arguing with him. It wasn't confrontational. It was curious. And it was really interesting because his face just changed. It just sort of, the color went out of his face. He kind of leaned back. He opened up his body language like he was relaxing. And he just said, "Wow." He said, "I've been telling that story for 2 years. And nobody has ever asked me what price I paid." He said, "They always just assumed, oh yeah, you paid a price, And he said, "And what's else? Now that I think about it, I don't think I paid a price." And he said, "But I really thought I had." And once we got to that
my goodness.
point, it was like, then we could talk, and we could talk about the pros and cons of what we were trying to do and how to handle this. And But it was really interesting to me that, sometimes you have to figure out that style. That was the style that worked for me. If I had tried to argue with him, it would not have worked for me. I would not have been effective, and it certainly would not have worked for him. He was one of those combative kind of guys. So, I think that's another illustration of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I love that. And, I think what it took is for you to recognize about yourself. Let me lean into my strengths of asking, open-ended questions with non-judgmental stance, right? And
Exactly,
it got there,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And with the giving voice to values approach, I mean, we have 7 pillars. I don't have to go into them all, but one of them is self-knowledge and alignment. And the idea is to understand how you are most effective and then frame the challenge you're facing in a way that plays to your strengths. When I would talk to very risk-taking, aggressive, assertive people, they would do this very differently. I have stories of how they've done it. And then I would talk to people who were introverts or risk averse, and they would do it in a very different way. And if they felt like they had to be one or the other, it wouldn't work. The assertive, aggressive risk taker, if I told them to be cautious and more conservative, they'd say, yeah, right, but it's not who I am. And if I told the introvert and the risk averse person they need to have moral courage, they'd say, well, that's great, but it's not who I am. And so we needed to find ways to frame the challenge you're facing so that it plays to your strengths.
Mm-hmm. I would love if you could give an overview of the all 7 pillars. You gave us one, which is self-knowledge and alignment, framing. What are the other ones?
Well, the first one is values, and we actually talked about at the beginning of this podcast, which is that we're looking at the values that tend to be shared, that we're looking at that high level set of values rather than a totally cultural relativistic kind of approach or a total universalist approach. We're looking for the places where we can find that common ground and then framing things in a language that communicate. The second one is what I call choice, and it's simply that people often don't believe they have a choice. We know from research that people tend to overemphasize or to exaggerate negative outcomes and to underemphasize positive outcomes, to think the positive was an exception and that the negative is the norm. And people tend to do this for evolutionarily effective reasons, right? We want to protect ourselves.
That's
But the
right.
thing is, it means that we limit our choices. So the second one is just to understand that we probably have more choices than we think. The third one is purpose. And what I mean by that is that you want to think about define your purpose in your career, in your workspace, in the broadest sense, not to get caught up in this quarter's results, but to really try and think about what am I trying to do here? Why am I in this industry, for example? Why am I in this functional area, whether it's audit or whether it's marketing or whether it's operations, to define yourself in that broader sense and then to appeal to that sense of purpose in the individuals you're speaking with, because you'll sort of be raising them to a different level of thinking about the issues. Then the next one is normalization. And the idea there is that people tend to think of these values conflicts as the exception. You're working along doing your job, and your boss comes and tells you to do something, and you're like a deer in headlight. And often people will just kind of put their heads down, do what he or she says, and try and get past it to get back to work. And what we've tried to understand is that these kinds of conflicts are the work, that values conflicts are a normal part of life. They happen every day, multiple times a day, at work, in our families, in our relationships. And if you normalize them, you kind of sort of bring that sense of exception and stress down, you can sort of approach them in the way that I talk about, which is like rehearse, prescript, practice, get more comfortable, understand how you're effective. So normalization. The fifth one is self-knowledge and alignment. I already explained that. It's playing to your strengths. The sixth one is voice, which is simply to understand that voice is a metaphor. There's lots of ways to do it. It can be a conversation. It can be a memo. It can be asking a question. It can be talking to someone who's going to talk to someone who's going to talk to the decision maker. It can be trying to get someone into a decision-making team who brings a different perspective. There's lots of different ways to voice. And then the final one is what we call reasons and rationalizations, which is that in my work, gathering many, many stories about how people encounter values conflicts, we hear the same kinds of reasons or rationalizations for why you can't act on your values or ethics over and over. And they're predictable and they're very powerful, but they're not bulletproof. But they're very hard to respond to in the moment. And so the idea is to identify a lot of them and to practice. So we hear things like, it's standard operating procedure in this industry or this part of the world or this organization, or it's not material, it's not a big enough deal to worry about, or it's not your responsibility, it's above your pay grade, or it may be a little bit dicey, but don't you feel loyalty to your company or your boss or your clients or your colleagues? So we hear those all the time. Those are the fours we hear often. There are some others, of course. And so we've actually worked with people to think about, how could I start to address these? So for example, if they're saying it's not a big enough deal to worry about, that's that sort of gives you the answer. It's like, so that's why it's really easy to address it now. If we wait till it's a big deal, there's going to be a lot more cost involved for the organization, for whoever was harmed by this behavior, for yourself, all of that. And so you just start to find ways to kind of twist these a bit and reframe them so that you can actually be heard. So those are the 7 pillars.
Thank you for sharing all of those. They're brilliant. We're reaching an ad break. When we come back, I'd love to dig into a couple of them where I just wrote a couple of notes or reactions and would love to hear more about those. You are listening to The Hard Skills with me, Dr. Mira Brancu, and our guest today, Dr. Mary Gentile, author of Giving Voice to Values, as well as the person who launched the curriculum. We air on Tuesdays at 5 p.m. and we'll be right back in just a moment.
Hey everybody, it's Tommy D, the Nonprofit Sector Connector, coming at you from my attic. Each week here on talkradio.nyc, I host the program Philanthropy in Focus. Nonprofits impact us each and every day, and it's my focus to help them amplify their message and tell their story. Listen each week at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time until 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on talkradio.nyc.
Hi, I'm Linda Marsanico. The A Train to Sedona is a memoir about my journey to love and compassion. It's also the name of my new broadcast on Wednesdays at 12 noon. When we are spiritual, we embrace possibilities and ideas, which strengthen our mind, body, spirit, health, and wisdom. On the A Train to Sedona broadcast, I plan to interview guests who embrace these expansive practices. Join us on Wednesdays at 12 noon on Talk Radio New York City.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to The Hard Skills with me, Dr. Mira Brancu, and our guest today, Dr. Mary Gentile of Giving Voice to Values. And Mary just shared with us her 7 pillars that go into the curriculum of how to sort of train ourselves to become better at giving voice to values. And there's a couple that I would love to dig into more. And the first thing that came up, which I really loved, was around normalization. That the idea that conflicts are the work, not to avoid getting back to work, and this actually reminds me of the things that we're doing with our own children, which is that a lot of parents try to overprotect their children from sort of difficult interactions and challenges, and our kids have come home from an early stage sharing something wrong that they witnessed, right? And they felt uncomfortable with. And, our whole goal has been, yes, we try to help them think it through, but in our head, we're training them for real life because it only gets harder and more difficult and more challenging. So you better have the skills and be ready to have practice a lot. it sounds like in some ways, this curriculum helps people catch up to that. If they didn't have a chance to practice constantly, doing these things, that this is a way to sort of go back to those, like, what do you do with all the feelings you have when something feels off? Is
Right,
that
right.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's funny you should use that analogy, because I find that often when I'm sharing GBV with people, even though it's with a corporate audience, some of their first things is that get triggered are to think about their families, their children, and how they're
Yeah.
raising them. But the idea of normalization actually came to me from an interview I was doing with a gentleman. He worked for a firm that was involved with a lot of mergers and acquisitions, right? And his job was often to be the one who would go, those deals often take many, many months, to work out. And his job, he was often going out and building relationships with the CEO and the CFO of the organizations that were going to be acquired as they negotiated the deals. And he told me the story. He said that he had been spending a few days with the CEO and CFO of a company that his firm was about to acquire. They'd been working on this for almost a year. They were near the end of the transaction, and it was one of his last visits with them. They'd spent a couple days together, and they were all at the airport having a glass of wine before they flew off into various directions. And the CEO and the CFO said to him, okay, and they'd become friends over the course of the year. And they said, okay, so tell us, what's really going to happen to us? What's going to happen with us? And he said he knew that he had a responsibility not to share any information of that sort that he may or may not have had. But he felt a relationship with these guys. He also didn't want to alienate them at this point of the deal. He was trying to figure out what to say. So I said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, Mary, he said, I lied. And then he paused and he said, instinctively, I lied. And then he said, but then I went home, he said, and I thought about it. And I thought, if I keep doing this kind of work, and I really like this work, he said, I'm going to get asked something like that every time. It's going to come up over and over and over again. So I can just lie every time, or I can spend an hour or two and just sit down and figure out what would be an honest answer that still respected my fiduciary responsibilities and all of that. And so he said he just came up with a little script for himself where he would basically say, even if I knew the answer to that, wouldn't be allowed to share it. But what I can tell you are some things that you can be doing that, based on my experience, are going to put you in the best possible position. And then he said he tried to have some substantive suggestions for people. And he said, the thing is, he said, it's not exactly what people would be asking for. It wouldn't be what they wanted him to tell them, but it would help them feel that they've been treated respectfully, they've been given something of value, and it could also maintain the relationship. And he said, the thing he realized is that this is a normal part of doing business. He said, this isn't an exception. And that's why he thought, why not prepare for it and have a response that is both honest, but also useful and respectful to my audience. And that's where the light bulb kind of went off for me about this.
Yeah. Oh, what an amazing story, and what an elegant solution. I love elegant solutions like that.
Yeah.
I'm curious, this triggered something for me about, right now, there's a lot of leaders that want to do the right thing, and they're very fearful of retaliation or the repercussions or the impact on their families, or the impact on their employees if they do the wrong thing, or don't capitulate to things that they think is wrong, but they're trying to protect one group versus another. All of this stuff is really, really challenging. I would love to hear any words of wisdom that you have using your Giving Voice to Values curriculum. Like, how might you apply it?
Yeah. So I think in terms of thinking about when to act,
Right.
there's a couple things that I think about. The first thing is, there are some issues that are just so important that we really we can't ignore them. I think one of the ways I think about that is if they are the precedent to some sort of immediate action that's going to have an impact, as opposed to people are thinking something through. So sometimes you just need to act. one of the things I tell people with giving voice to values is that, we often feel like people hear the expression giving voice to values and they'll think it's about whistleblowing. And actually, I created GVV because I kept seeing all the research on whistleblowing and how, first of all, it was often too late. The damage had already been done. The person who blew the whistle often suffered some sort of ramifications from blowing the whistle. I mean, there were all these reasons why it wasn't the best solution. And so what I really wanted GVV to be about was about changing the conversation in the organization, so that you don't necessarily get to that point where blowing the whistle is necessary, that people start to talk about these things early on when they're starting down a path that's going to lead to potential real dangers. And so that was, one of the things that I try and talk to people about is, the risks are lower and the chance of having an impact is higher if you actually do that. So that's one thing. But another thing is I also think about, and also because you're doing it when it's smaller, the stakes are lower in terms of everything involved.
Yeah.
But also to think about, if you have a good approach, use it. Even if it doesn't feel like this is the most important issue in the world, if you think you have something really useful, use it, because it's going to both build your habit and your sort of muscle memory. I call it a moral muscle memory. Build your moral muscle memory to be able to do this. It also helps people understand that you actually have some interesting and useful ways of approaching these kinds of values conflicts. And it makes it more likely that you will do it again. And then I also ask people to think about, are you responding from a place of calm, a place of competence, and a place of compassion? Because I think it's not, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you're not calm, you should never do anything, but it might mean you might need to wait a minute. You might need to go back and think about what's the most effective approach. Or if you don't feel competent, that doesn't mean that you should never act. It might mean you need to find someone to work with you, to find an ally who actually has whatever skill or insight or expertise is necessary. And if you're not feeling compassionate, perhaps you need to do a little self-reflection about that. But, I like to ask people to think about those three things. So a lot of this is about building the habit, building the muscle memory, building the skillfulness, understanding that there are so many different ways to voice and act on your values. It's not just going and telling your boss off, that's probably not the most effective strategy. All of that said, and that would usually be my answer if I were doing a podcast like this a few years ago. All of that being said, I think we're at a moment in history right now. We're at a moment in our lives right now where we really also need to be thinking about, there are some things that we might have used as norms for making decisions, for like the most effective way to act, that aren't really working anymore. We're at a place right now where there's such a degree of polarization. There's so many threats that we didn't actually expect, that it's certainly in our capitalist system in the United States that we certainly didn't expect that we'd be dealing with. There's changes in terms of the way laws and regulations are being pursued and enforced that are having an impact on businesses. So I think that all of that is going on right now, which means that it probably is a time when you also need to be spending some serious time having conversations with your employees, with your your C-suite, your management, and even with your consumers, to begin to understand, we may need to act differently than we would have in different times, that our normal forms of behavior are not necessarily designed to cope with some of the kinds of challenges that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, absolutely. These are all really good points. One of the things, there's a couple of things I want to highlight and pull out from what you said. One is how you define voice is, so flexible and allows it. It's almost like you could replace it with act. Take any action, right? Just take any action and it will give voice. You're speaking through your actions. And
Exactly.
Those actions can be different for different people. You gave lots and lots of examples of how you can take an action, and that does feel a lot more empowering than taking no action whatsoever, which feels very disempowering right now, especially. And then the other is, to sort of think about like, what kind of person, what kind of leader do I want to show up with in the world today? What is needed? What do I want to see that I'm not seeing or I need more of? And how can I offer that to the world through my own actions? And, you described some of them around, changing the conversation, showing up as calm, competent, and compassionate. We need that. Why don't you offer that? Right? I can offer that. Right? I can offer that. And then, a lot of sort of like recognizing that now girding resilience will also require building community, getting, support systems in place, being a little bit more uncomfortable than your usual. And all of those things might need to be added into sort of like the planning and thinking about how to show up right now in particular. And I could sort of share like, myself, the thing that I'm trying to do really a lot more of is a lot of those things that you shared, just trying to bring kind of a voice of calm, a voice of reason, a voice of support, compassion whenever I can, all of those things. So, I think there's a lot, like you said, we have choice. There's a lot more choices that we haven't thought through that we actually have. And I love that part of it too.
Exactly. I love what you just laid out there. And I think one of the things that you were pointing out is that when you act in the way that you can act, that playing to your strengths, playing to your skills, all of that, you're also setting an example. You're kind of opening the path for other people to act in their way.
Yes.
One of the exercises I created when I first designed GVV is I called it starting assumptions for giving voice to values. And there's a set of things that, in order to do this and in order to do it effectively, these are assumptions that we start from. And so there are things like, I'm not alone, but then you follow, I'm not the only one who feels this way, but then you follow that by acknowledging that, but if I don't say or do or, somehow express it, nobody else will know that I feel this way. And so you won't know that you're not alone, and they won't know that they're not alone. And so we have this set of assumptions like that, and others are, this is worth doing, and, lots of assumptions. But then at the end, when I would use this as an exercise, I'd give this set of, I think it was like 12 assumptions. And then I would ask people, whether it was in a company or in a classroom, to think about, do you think these are true? Do you think it's true that it's important to act on your values? Do you think it's true that you're not the only one? Do you think, and what was interesting is that the outcome of that exercise would be that they're true if you make them true, if you act that way. And if you don't act that way, you make them untrue. And so the thing is that it's a matter of choice again, it's like by acting as if these are true, I create a context wherein these things can happen. But if I act as if I am the only one, I'm going to ensure that I'm alone, those kinds of things. So I think it's, it's one of those, it can be a virtuous circle or a non-virtuous circle.
Very, very good. Yeah, great points. I have one more question for you when we come back from the ad break, and then we will start sort of closing out, sharing kind of what people can do as next steps. You are listening to The Hard Skills with me, Dr. Mira Brancu, and our guest today, Dr. Mary Gentile, author of Giving Voice to Values. We air on Tuesdays at 5 p.m. You could find us at talkradio.nyc, and we'll be right back in just a moment.
Were you an essential worker during the pandemic? If you needed to learn stages of epilepsy, did you depend on advocates? Did you use new innovations to cope with mental and neurological issues? Maintaining high quality of life and keeping good mental health are what we all strive for. I'm Frank R. Harrison, host of Frank About Health, and each week top healthcare influencers, professionals, and innovators answer these questions and more. Stay tuned on Thursdays at 5 p.m. on talkradio.nyc, and I will continue to be frank about health with all of you.
Are you a conscious co-creator? Are you on a quest to raise your vibration and your consciousness? I'm Sam Leibowitz, your conscious consultant, and on my show, The Conscious Consultant Hour Awakening Humanity, we will touch upon all these topics and more. Listen live at our new time on Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern Time. That's The Conscious Consultant Hour Awakening Humanity, Thursdays 12 noon on talkradio.nyc.
You're listening to Talk Radio NYC at www.talkradio.nyc. Now broadcasting 24 hours a day.
Welcome back to The Hard Skills with me, Dr. Mira Brancu, and our guest today, Dr. Mary Gentile of Giving Voice to Values. And Mary, you have shared so many different ways that we can think about how to step into, giving voice to values, how to really take action on the things that are most important. And my one remaining question for you is, there are so many people's values being violated or feel like so much is being thrown at us right now. And, I feel like I could put my energy in a million different directions right now. A lot of people feel this way, right? We can't act on everything. So especially like within organizations that are being impacted in multiple ways, right? Whether like funding is being taken away or now you have to, fire and riffs, and now you need to focus on removing, these words and not those words, and all of this stuff. There's lots of things going on, right? That require organizational response. How can leaders prioritize and stay focused if they're feeling like they can't possibly give voice to all the values? How do they make that kind of final decision?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that's really important to do is to realize that each of us individually cannot do everything, but that doesn't mean that we can't support everything. And so I think especially when you're in a position of leadership, a lot of it has to do with identifying, who has a particular investment and perhaps expertise or commitment or innovative approach to a particular issue, and ask them to kind of be the voice or the face of some of these things. It's not that all of us have to do everything, because then we'll do nothing well. But the thing that's important is when people do that kind of sharing, sometimes they don't make it explicit. And I see this happen a lot, that people will think it was my idea that she would handle this and that he would do this, and you may even have talked to them about it. But if you haven't made that clear if you're in a leadership position, I'm thinking now, if you haven't made that clear to your organization, people think that you're not caring about that. They don't understand that. And so I think one of the most important things for a leader is the communication part, is the part about expressing what is it that we as an organization really care about, how are we going to approach it, and then making it clear that you are working through other people, as opposed to feeling like you have to lead on every single issue. So I think, often there's this understanding we can find allies, but we don't actually make it explicit that that's what we're doing. It's one of the things that I learned when I first started sharing GVV. Organizations would ask me to come in and do trainings and programs, etc. And they would often, it was the senior leaders who would say, we know about values, we're okay. Do this for our middle management and our lower level managers, And eventually people started realizing, no, maybe we need to talk about this at the senior level too, but you talk about it a little differently. So instead of the rehearsal and the practice and the pre-scripting around speaking up, it might be about speaking across to your partners, right? To your C-suite colleagues who you need to be able to have a collegial relationship with them. Or it might mean having to think about how do I create a context, a culture where I make it clear that I actually invite people to raise these kinds of issues. And then I think one of the most important ones is for a senior leader is how do I hear it when someone brings it to me? And you can do the same kind of rehearsal and pre-scripting and practice around how you hear it as you do about how you raise it. And that's another place where people often don't communicate. You know, they'll it's never good news when someone brings this to you. And so the person who brings it, you know, they don't necessarily get thanked. They don't necessarily feel like their message was welcome. They don't necessarily hear any follow-up, even if you do follow up in good faith, you know. So again, this part about from a leadership role, a huge part of it is communicating that.
Yeah, yeah, brilliant, brilliant. Mary, how can people find out more about your work?
Sure, sure. So there's obviously a website which you're putting up. It's just givingvoicetovaluesthebook.com. And you'll find there links to the book. And there's also a lot of follow-up books, you know, applying this to medicine or to law or to governance. There's even one about young adult education. You know, they apply this approach in different contexts. But then there's also links to the curriculum. There's MOOCs, there's videos, there's interactive online cohort-based programs, all kinds of things.
Wow.
And you can email me, which is also on that website.
Awesome. That's a wealth of resources available here today. Thank you so much for sharing all of this incredible, useful, timely information. And audience, what did you take away from today? And more importantly, what is one small change you can implement this week based on what you learned from Mary? Share it with us on LinkedIn and at talkradio.nyc so we could cheer you on. The Hard Skills is also on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Twitch, Apple, Spotify, Amazon podcasts, all over the place. If today's episode resonated for you, share it with a colleague, leave a review. And if you're looking for more personalized support with leadership or team coaching, you could reach out to Mary Gentile, as well as you can reach out to me, gotowerscope.com. Thank you, talkradio.nyc, for hosting. Together, we will navigate the complexities of leadership and emerge stronger on the other side. Thank you for joining me, Mary. Really loved having you.
Thanks.
Take care, everybody.